The town of Ridgeview was a place where time seemed to slow down. Nestled between rolling hills and winding country roads, it was a small, tight-knit community where everyone knew each other's names, and life followed a familiar rhythm. It was a sunny afternoon, the kind of day where the sky was a clear, perfect blue, and a gentle breeze rustled the leaves on the trees that lined Main Street. Children played in the park, shopkeepers exchanged friendly conversations with passers-by, and families like Sarah and her daughter Emily enjoyed their daily routines. Sarah, a woman in her mid-40s with soft, sun-kissed skin and warm, green eyes, owned a modest flower shop on the corner of Main and Willow. She had lived in Ridgeview her entire life, and in many ways, her days were just like the town itself, quiet, predictable, and safe. She found solace in her work, arranging bouquets and tending to her small but thriving business. Her 10-year-old daughter Emily, with her wild curls and curious mind, was her constant companion. After school, Emily would often walk with Sarah, chatting about her day while Sarah listened with a smile. It was a simple life, but it was theirs, and Sarah had grown comfortable with the peace it brought. But this day, as Sarah and Emily walked home from school, was anything but ordinary. As they turned the corner onto Maple Street, they saw a small figure sitting on the sidewalk, head buried in her hands, her shoulders shaking with sobs. The girl couldn't have been more than 7 or 8 years old. Her clothes were rumpled, and her hair fell in tangled waves around her tear-streaked face. Emily tugged at Sarah's sleeve, her voice a whisper. "Mom, why is that girl crying?" Sarah felt a pang in her chest. Something about the sight of the little girl, alone and crying so desperately in the middle of a quiet street, tugged at her heart. Without a second thought, she gently pulled Emily along with her, heading toward the child. "Sweetheart, are you okay?" Sarah asked softly, kneeling down beside the girl. "Where's your mom or dad?" The girl, whose name they would soon learn was Anna, didn't look up. Her sobs grew louder, almost as if she couldn't contain the emotions welling up inside her. Sarah's concern deepened. There was something more than just sadness in this child's tears. There was fear, deep and consuming. Just as Sarah was about to reach out to comfort the girl, she heard the familiar sound of footsteps approaching from behind. She turned to see Mr. Carter, the town's wealthiest resident, striding toward them. He was a tall, imposing man in his early 60s, with silver hair slicked back and an air of calm authority that made him stand out among Ridgeview's quieter residents. Mr. Carter was known for his wealth and philanthropy. He had donated generously to local schools, hospitals, and charities, earning him a reputation as a man who cared deeply for the town and its people. Despite his generosity, there was always a certain distance he maintained from others, as if his fortune had created an invisible barrier. "Is she all right?" Mr. Carter's voice was deep, but there was a softness to it as he knelt beside the sobbing child. His sharp, blue eyes filled with concern as he gently placed a hand on Anna's shoulder. "What's the matter, little one?" For a brief moment, Anna's sobs quieted, and she looked up at Mr. Carter through tear-filled eyes. Her face was red, her breathing ragged from crying so hard. She blinked at him, her lips trembling as if trying to find the words. I, she stammered, her small voice barely audible. Mr. Carter leaned in closer, his expression softening. "You're safe," he whispered gently, his tone meant to reassure her. "Whatever it is, it's going to be okay." The crowd that had begun to gather around the scene watched in silence, everyone waiting to see what would happen next. Sarah, still crouching beside Emily, felt her pulse quicken. Something about the way Anna was looking at Mr. Carter, the fear, the hesitation, made her uneasy. Then, as if summoning every ounce of strength she had, Anna leaned toward Mr. Carter's ear and whispered something. Her words were so quiet that no one else could hear them, not even Sarah, who was only a few feet away. The effect was immediate. Mr. Carter's face, usually so composed and unreadable, suddenly went pale. His eyes widened, and for the first time in all the years Sarah had known him, she saw something unfamiliar in his expression. Shock, perhaps even fear. He stood up abruptly, stepping back from Anna as if her words had physically struck him. The onlookers gasped softly, confused by the sudden shift in his demeanor. Even Anna seemed startled by his reaction, her tear-streaked face frozen in confusion. What did she say? Someone from the crowd muttered under their breath, echoing the question that was now racing through Sarah's mind. Mr. Carter didn't respond. Instead, he looked down at the sobbing child with a mix of disbelief and something else, something darker that Sarah couldn't quite place. Without another word, Mr. Carter turned and walked away, his strides long and hurried, as if he couldn't leave fast enough. The crowd parted for him, still whispering among themselves, their eyes following his retreating figure until he disappeared down the street. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. What could Anna, a small, innocent girl, have possibly said to make a man like Mr. Carter react that way? She looked back at the child, who had curled into herself again, crying softly. A sense of dread settled over Sarah. Whatever had just happened was far from over. The town of Ridgeview had always whispered about Mr. Carter, though no one dared to say anything outright. He wasn't just the wealthiest man in town. He was its benefactor, its silent protector. His mansion, sitting on the outskirts of town behind tall iron gates, had an air of mystery around it. People spoke of his kindness, of his donations to the local schools and hospitals, but there was always a hint of something more in the way they talked about him. Something unspoken, as if everyone knew that beneath the surface of his generosity lay a deeper, unresolved pain. Years ago, Mr. Carter had lost his only daughter, Lily. She was just 7 years old when the accident happened, a car crash that took her life on a foggy autumn evening. The tragedy shattered him. He and his wife had been driving her home from school when the car veered off the road. His wife survived the crash, but Lily didn't. The loss of his daughter sent his life into a downward spiral, eventually leading to the dissolution of his marriage. Mrs. Carter moved away, seeking solace in distance, but Mr. Carter stayed in Ridgeview, burying himself in work and philanthropy. He never talked about Lily, but the town remembered. Every year on the anniversary of her death, Mr. Carter would visit her grave in the small cemetery on the hill, leaving a single white lily. It was a quiet ritual, but everyone knew what it meant. It was his way of keeping her memory alive, even as he threw himself into helping the town's children, perhaps in some effort to fill the void that Lily had left behind. But despite his wealth and status, there was always an emptiness in Mr. Carter's eyes. It was the kind of hollow gaze that only comes from a loss so deep it can never fully heal. His charitable work was a balm for his wounds, but it wasn't enough. And now, after all these years, a few whispered words from a crying child had brought that wound roaring back to life. Sarah could relate to loss, though hers was different. Not long ago, her life had taken a turn she never expected. Her husband, Mark, had walked out on her and Emily, leaving her to raise their daughter alone. It had been a sudden departure, with Mark claiming that he needed space to figure things out, but Sarah knew better. He wasn't coming back. Since then, she'd been juggling the roles of both mother and father, trying to keep their lives together, while managing the flower shop that was her only source of income. It wasn't easy. Financial struggles had become a constant companion, and there were nights when Sarah lay awake, worrying about how she'd make ends meet. But no matter how hard things got, she always put on a brave face for Emily. Her daughter was the one thing that kept her grounded, the one bright spot in a world that had grown increasingly uncertain. Emily, for her part, was a resilient child, though Sarah could see the toll her father's absence was taking on her. She would often ask when he was coming back, and Sarah would always find a way to change the subject, hoping to spare her daughter the pain of knowing the truth. They were getting by, but just barely, and the weight of it all was beginning to wear on Sarah. So when she saw Anna, sobbing in the street with no one to comfort her, something in Sarah broke. She understood the kind of loneliness that comes from being abandoned, and she wasn't about to let another child feel that same emptiness. But as the events of that afternoon unfolded, Sarah realized there was far more to Anna's story than she had initially thought. The next day, the town was buzzing with speculation. People were still talking about Mr. Carter's strange reaction to Anna's whispered words, and rumors were beginning to spread. Who was Anna? Where were her parents? And what could she have possibly said to rattle a man like Mr. Carter? Sarah couldn't stop thinking about it. After Mr. Carter had walked away, Sarah had taken Anna to the police station, hoping to help her find her family. The officers were kind but clearly concerned. It turned out that Anna's mother, Laura, had been missing for several days. No one had seen her around town, and Anna had been wandering alone. Her father, who lived in a nearby city, was estranged from Laura and hadn't been involved in Anna's life for months. As Sarah sat in the police station, waiting for answers, she overheard some of the officers talking quietly in the corner. There were whispers of trouble in Anna's home, rumors of debts, dangerous people, and threats. Laura had been in a difficult situation, but no one knew just how deep her troubles went. Sarah's stomach tightened as she listened. This was more than just a missing person case. There was a darkness surrounding Anna's life, one that no one in the town had been fully aware of. As Sarah left the police station with Emily that evening, she couldn't shake the feeling that something much bigger was at play. What had Anna whispered to Mr. Carter? And why had it affected him so deeply? The next morning, Sarah decided to take a walk through town, hoping to clear her mind. She stopped by the local cafe, where she often chatted with her friend, Claire, who worked there. Claire, like everyone else in Ridgeview, had heard about the incident. "So, did you hear what the little girl said to Mr. Carter?" Claire asked, her eyes wide with curiosity. "No," Sarah replied, taking a sip of her coffee. "But whatever it was, it shook him. I've never seen him like that." "I heard she said something about his daughter," Claire whispered, leaning in closer. "You know Lily." Sarah's heart skipped a beat. Could it be? She hadn't even considered the possibility that Anna's words might have something to do with Mr. Carter's long-buried grief. But the more she thought about it, the more it made sense. Lily's death had been a tragedy that the town never forgot, and if Anna had somehow triggered those painful memories, it could explain Mr. Carter's reaction. But there was still so much that didn't add up. Why was Anna alone in the street? Where was her mother? And why had Mr. Carter, of all people, been so affected by her words? As the days passed, Sarah found herself drawn deeper into the mystery. She couldn't let it go, not when so many questions remained unanswered. Every time she looked at Emily, she thought of Anna, of the fear and sadness in the little girl's eyes. And every time she thought of Mr. Carter, she remembered the haunted look on his face when he walked away. Something was wrong. Something much bigger than a lost child and a grieving millionaire. And Sarah was determined to find out what it was. In the days that followed, Ridgeview became a town of whispers. No one could stop talking about Mr. Carter's sudden, strange reaction to Anna's whispered words. What had once been admiration and respect for the wealthy philanthropist began to shift into something darker. The people of Ridgeview had always been curious about Mr. Carter, but now that curiosity bordered on suspicion. It started with small, casual comments exchanged over coffee or in the aisles of the local grocery store. "I've never seen him look so shaken," one of the locals mentioned at the cafe, stirring their coffee absently. "What could a little girl have said to make him react like that?" "Well, you know he's never really gotten over losing Lily," another would chime in. Maybe the girl reminded him of her. "I heard she said something about his past. Something he's been hiding all these years," someone else whispered, eyes darting around to make sure they weren't overheard. These conversations spread like wildfire, and soon Mr. Carter found himself at the center of a storm of rumors. He stopped going out in public altogether. His usual appearances at charity events and town gatherings ceased, and the once friendly face that Ridgeview had come to know became a ghost in the mansion on the hill. People began to speculate about his absence, and the more he stayed away, the more the rumors grew. Sarah couldn't shake the image of Anna sitting in the street, crying so desperately that day. And she couldn't forget Mr. Carter's face. The shock, the fear, the guilt. She wasn't one for gossip, but as the days passed, she realized that there was more to Anna's situation than anyone understood. She felt responsible for the girl, in a way. After all, it had been her instinct to approach Anna, to try to help, and now she couldn't let it go. She decided to act. Sarah went back to the police station, determined to find answers. She asked for updates on Anna's mother, Laura, but the authorities had little to offer. Laura had simply vanished, leaving behind no trace of where she might have gone or why. The officers were doing their best, but there was a sense of helplessness in the investigation, as if everyone was expecting the worst, but didn't know how to proceed. "It's like she just disappeared," one of the officers said, shaking his head. "No activity on her accounts, no phone calls, nothing. We're still looking, but, well, it's not looking good." That wasn't enough for Sarah. She wanted to do more, to find a way to help Anna and uncover whatever was happening in the shadows. But the more she tried to dig, the more she hit dead ends. It felt like there was someone, keeping the truth hidden, and no one was willing to admit what it was. Meanwhile, Emily had grown increasingly attached to Anna. Every time they visited the police station or asked around town, Emily would beg Sarah to take Anna home with them, to let her stay until her mother was found. Anna, who had been placed in temporary foster care, seemed to trust no one but Sarah and Emily. Whenever they saw her, Anna would cling to Emily's hand, her wide, frightened eyes searching for some kind of reassurance. "Please, Mom," Emily said one evening as they sat at the dinner table. "Anna's scared. She doesn't want to be with strangers. Can't we just help her?" Sarah's heart ached for both girls. She had tried reaching out to the foster agency, but they were bound by strict protocols. Still, Sarah knew she couldn't stand by and do nothing. She had to find out what happened to Anna's mother and why Mr. Carter seemed to be at the center of it all. One evening, Sarah made up her mind. She needed to confront Mr. Carter directly. If anyone knew what had happened to Anna's mother, or why the little girl had reacted the way she did, it had to be him. She didn't know what to expect, but she couldn't shake the feeling that the answers she sought were behind those tall iron gates. With determination, Sarah drove to Mr. Carter's mansion. The gates loomed large and intimidating, but Sarah steeled herself and rang the intercom. After a long pause, the gates slowly creaked open, and Sarah made her way up the winding driveway. The mansion itself was a grand, sprawling estate, but tonight it felt cold and foreboding. She knocked on the heavy wooden door, and after what felt like an eternity, the door creaked open to reveal Mr. Carter himself. He looked different. The confident, controlled man she had seen so many times before now appeared gaunt and tired. His eyes, once sharp and penetrating, were hollow. The weight of whatever burden he was carrying had clearly taken its toll. "Mr. Carter," Sarah began, her voice firm but kind, "I need to talk to you about Anna." For a moment, Mr. Carter said nothing. He simply stared at her, his expression unreadable. Then, without a word, he stepped aside and gestured for her to enter. The two sat in a quiet, dimly lit study. The room was filled with books and memorabilia, but there was an overwhelming sense of isolation. Sarah could see that Mr. Carter had been living in his own personal prison, haunted by whatever had happened that day. "I don't know what Anna told you," Sarah said gently, "but I do know that whatever she said has shaken you, and now she's without her mother. I'm just trying to help. Please, if there's anything you can tell me." Mr. Carter remained silent for a long time, staring into the fireplace as if the flames held the answers he was too afraid to give. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and strained. I can't talk about it," he muttered, his hands trembling slightly. "I wish I could, but there are things you don't understand." Sarah felt a wave of frustration, but she kept her voice calm. "I don't understand because no one will tell me the truth. Anna is a child. She's scared and she's alone. Whatever this is, we need to help her." Mr. Carter's eyes flickered with emotion, but he remained guarded. "I'm trying to help," he said softly, almost to himself. "But I don't know if I can." Sarah left the mansion that night with more questions than answers. Mr. Carter was clearly holding something back, but whether it was out of guilt, fear, or something else entirely, she couldn't tell. The town's rumors had taken root in her mind, and though she wanted to believe Mr. Carter was innocent, something about his reluctance worried her deeply. The rumors surrounding Mr. Carter only intensified as more time passed. The town's residents were no longer whispering. They were outright accusing. Some believed that Anna's words had been a cry for help, an accusation that Mr. Carter had something to do with her mother's disappearance. Others thought he was hiding a dark secret from his past, something related to the loss of his own daughter. Speculation became wild. Some claimed to have seen strange people visiting the mansion late at night. Others said they'd heard screaming. The stories grew more elaborate with each telling, and soon, even Mr. Carter's charitable work was called into question. "How can we trust him?" one local woman said at the grocery store. "If he's hiding something this big, what else don't we know about him?" It wasn't long before Mr. Carter's absence from the public eye began to affect his reputation. Donations to his charities started to dwindle, and people avoided his name in polite conversation. He had gone from being Ridgeview's most respected citizen to its most controversial figure. And all the while, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that the town had missed something, that whatever the truth was, it was far more complicated than the rumors suggested. But she couldn't ignore the fact that whatever Anna had whispered to Mr. Carter, it had left him visibly haunted. And until she found out the truth, the tension hanging over Ridgeview would only continue to grow. As the days went by, Sarah's sense of unease deepened. Her attempts to dig into Anna's past had led her down a surprising path, one that revealed a hidden layer of Mr. Carter's life that no one in Ridgeview had ever known. Through subtle inquiries with some of the older townspeople, Sarah discovered a detail that sent a chill down her spine. Years ago, Anna's mother, Laura, had been involved in a secret relationship with Mr. Carter. The affair had been brief and intense, occurring shortly after the tragic loss of Mr. Carter's daughter, Lily. Back then, Mr. Carter had been in a fragile emotional state, still reeling from the accident that claimed his daughter's life. Laura had been a young, beautiful woman, carefree and uninhibited, and in many ways, the opposite of Mr. Carter's late wife. Their relationship had been a poorly kept secret among those who moved in Ridgeview's upper social circles, but it had ended abruptly, and Laura had vanished from town not long after. Now, as Sarah pieced the story together, she realized the shocking truth. Anna was likely Mr. Carter's daughter. The resemblance, once pointed out, seemed obvious. The same pale blue eyes, the same dark hair. But this revelation opened a new set of questions. If Anna was Mr. Carter's child, why hadn't he known? And what role had their past played in Laura's disappearance? Sarah decided to keep her discovery to herself until she could gather more evidence. The stakes were too high to act on a hunch alone. Weeks passed with Mr. Carter maintaining his reclusive lifestyle. The mansion on the hill remained silent, and the town's gossip only grew. However, just when Sarah thought the mystery might go unsolved, something unexpected happened. One afternoon, as she was preparing to close up the flower shop, Sarah received a knock at her door. She opened it to find Mr. Carter standing there, looking more haggard and worn than she had ever seen him. His face was gaunt, and his eyes seemed haunted by some inner torment. "I need to talk to you," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. They sat down in the back of the shop, and for the first time, Mr. Carter opened up about what had happened that day in the street. He told Sarah how Anna's whispered words had cut him to the core. "She's gone, and it's your fault." At first, Sarah thought Anna must have been referring to Laura, her missing mother, but as Mr. Carter spoke, it became clear that Anna's words had reopened an old wound. He believed that Anna had somehow channeled his deepest guilt, the guilt of failing to save his own daughter, Lily, from the car accident that took her life. "I should have done more," Mr. Carter confessed, his voice breaking. I could have stopped it. I could have saved her. For years, Mr. Carter had carried the weight of his daughter's death, blaming himself for the accident. He had thrown himself into charity work, trying to atone for what he believed was his failure as a father. And now, Anna's words had ripped open that old scar, leaving him raw and vulnerable once again. But as Sarah listened, she realized there was more to the story. While Mr. Carter was consumed by his own guilt over Lily's death, Anna's whispered accusation seemed to carry a double meaning. It wasn't just Lily she was referring to. It was her mother. The pieces began to fall into place for Sarah. Anna's words, though directed at Mr. Carter, held more than just the sorrow of a grieving father. They carried the weight of something far more recent and immediate: the disappearance of Laura. Sarah debated whether or not to reveal what she had discovered about Mr. Carter's past with Laura. She knew that the truth could shatter him, but it was the key to understanding what had happened. Still, there was a hesitation in her. What if confronting Mr. Carter with this information pushed him over the edge? What if, in his fragile state, he couldn't handle the truth that Anna might be his daughter? She decided to wait. There were too many unanswered questions, and she needed more time to figure out what had really happened to Laura before she could act. The last thing she wanted was to make a move without being absolutely sure. Just as Sarah was beginning to make sense of the tangled web, she received a phone call that sent a chill down her spine. It was the police. "Sarah, we found Laura," the officer said, his tone somber. Laura's body had been discovered in a nearby river, tangled in the roots of an old tree. The coroner estimated she had been dead for weeks, likely around the time she had first disappeared. But it wasn't the discovery of her body that shocked Sarah. It was the cause of death. Laura hadn't drowned accidentally. The police believed there had been foul play. The weight of this revelation settled heavily on Sarah's shoulders. If Laura had been murdered, the entire dynamic of the situation had changed. Was Mr. Carter involved? Could his past relationship with Laura have played a role in her death? Or was there someone else, lurking in the shadows, who had wanted Laura gone? The news spread through Ridgeview like wildfire. The once quiet town was now filled with fear and suspicion. People began to openly question Mr. Carter's involvement, and the police launched a formal investigation into Laura's death. The rumors that had once been whispered in quiet corners of cafes and shops were now shouted in the open. Sarah didn't know what to believe. Mr. Carter's reaction to Anna's words suggested deep guilt, but was it the guilt of a grieving father or something more sinister? Had his relationship with Laura ended on bad terms, leading to something darker? Or was there someone else, connected to Laura's hidden life, who had wanted her dead? The discovery of Laura's body brought everything to a head. Ridgeview was no longer a town of quiet gossip. It had become a community on edge, waiting for the truth to emerge. Sarah knew one thing for sure. Whatever had happened to Laura, it had left a mark on everyone involved, especially Anna. The little girl's whispered accusation, "She's gone, and it's your fault," had been both a cry of grief and a chilling premonition. The truth was closer than ever, but it was a truth no one in Ridgeview had expected. As news of Laura's body spread throughout Ridgeview, the once quiet town descended into chaos. The discovery of her lifeless form in the river confirmed everyone's worst fears, and soon wild accusations filled the air. Whispers that had once been confined to small gatherings were now openly shouted in the streets and posted in online forums. And at the center of it all was Mr. Carter, a man who had once been Ridgeview's most respected figure, now transformed into a pariah in the eyes of the town. He did it, didn't he? People murmured at the local grocery store. "It's always the rich ones. He probably thought he could get away with it." "I heard they were having an affair," another said, the gossip spreading like wildfire. "Maybe he killed her when she wanted to leave him." The rumors grew more outlandish by the day. Some said that Mr. Carter had been hiding dark secrets for years, that he had a history of covering up crimes. Others believed he had manipulated the authorities with his wealth, keeping them at bay for as long as possible. The police investigation had intensified, and Mr. Carter was now officially a person of interest. Meanwhile, Sarah couldn't shake the weight of responsibility pressing down on her. She knew more than the rest of the town. She knew about Mr. Carter's past with Laura, about their affair, and the likely truth that Anna was his daughter. But Sarah also sensed there was something far deeper and more complex at play, something the town had yet to grasp. And until she uncovered the whole truth, Mr. Carter would remain under the cloud of suspicion, his reputation hanging by a thread. In the midst of the town's turmoil, Anna grew more fearful by the day. The little girl had been placed under Sarah's care temporarily, given the growing tension surrounding the investigation and her reluctance to speak to anyone else. Anna, once a quiet but open child, now barely spoke at all. She clung to Emily, and whenever anyone tried to ask her questions about her mother or Mr. Carter, she would shrink away, her wide eyes filled with dread. It wasn't until one quiet evening, while Sarah and Emily were sitting with Anna at the dinner table, that Anna finally broke her silence. She whispered to Sarah, her small voice trembling. "Mom was scared of him," Anna said, her eyes welling with tears. "She told me to stay away from Mr. Carter. Before she disappeared, she said he could hurt us." The revelation sent a chill through Sarah. Up until now, she had believed that Mr. Carter's relationship with Laura, though tumultuous, had been more of a lost love than anything dangerous. But now, hearing Anna's words, Sarah wasn't so sure. If Laura had been scared of Mr. Carter, what had really happened in the days leading up to her disappearance? And had Anna's whispered warning, "She's gone, and it's your fault," meant more than just reopening old wounds about his daughter? The fear in Anna's voice was real, and it echoed the growing suspicion in Sarah's mind. But there was still something that didn't sit right with her. Mr. Carter had been shaken by Anna's words, not defensive. If he was truly involved in Laura's death, why did he seem more tormented than guilty? The next few days were a whirlwind of emotions for Sarah. The town's anger toward Mr. Carter grew, and the police continued their investigation, seemingly convinced that he had something to do with Laura's death. But Sarah's instincts told her there was more to the story. Determined to uncover the truth, she began digging deeper into Laura's past. That's when she discovered something no one had been talking about. Through an old friend of Laura's, Sarah learned that Laura had been involved with some dangerous people in the months before her disappearance. She had fallen in with a group of criminals, debt collectors, and shady figures who operated on the fringes of society. Laura had accumulated significant debts, and these people had been pressuring her for money. She had been hiding from them, terrified for her life, and it seemed that her relationship with Mr. Carter had been one of her few remaining connections to safety. As Sarah delved further into Laura's life, she uncovered a critical piece of information. Mr. Carter had been trying to protect Laura. He hadn't known about Anna, but he had been trying to help Laura escape the clutches of the dangerous people she was involved with. They had reconnected briefly before her disappearance, and he had tried to set her up with money to get away. But by the time he realized just how serious her situation was, it had been too late. Laura had already been ensnared by forces beyond his control, and she had vanished before he could do anything to stop it. The truth hit Sarah like a wave. Mr. Carter wasn't responsible for Laura's death. He had been trying to save her. With this new information, Sarah knew she had to confront Mr. Carter again. This time, she had evidence, conversations with Laura's old friends, details about her debts, and the people she had been involved with. It was clear that Laura had been in serious danger, and Mr. Carter had been one of the few people trying to help her escape it. She drove to Mr. Carter's mansion once more, the weight of the town's accusations heavy in her mind. The iron gates creaked open slowly, and she found him sitting in his study, looking even more defeated than before. The shadows under his eyes told her he hadn't been sleeping, and the lines on his face seemed to deepen with each passing day. "Mr. Carter," Sarah began, her voice steady but urgent, "I know the truth." He looked up at her, his eyes searching her face for answers. "The truth. I know about Laura. I know you were trying to protect her from the people she was involved with." For a moment, Mr. Carter said nothing. Then, a heavy sigh escaped his lips, and he buried his face in his hands. "I tried," he whispered, his voice breaking. "But I couldn't save her. She was in too deep." Sarah could see the weight of his guilt, but she needed to know one more thing. "Why didn't you tell anyone? Why didn't you come forward when she disappeared?" He looked up at her, his eyes filled with a mix of pain and shame. I thought they'd blame me. I thought if I told them about our past, about everything, they'd think I had something to do with it. And maybe, in some way, I still feel responsible. I should have done more." As the gravity of his words settled in, Sarah realized that Mr. Carter had been caught in a web of fear and guilt. His own grief over losing his daughter had paralyzed him from acting when it mattered most. But now, with the truth laid bare, there was a chance to set things right. As Sarah left Mr. Carter's mansion, the authorities were closing in. The police, still investigating Laura's death, had been working off old leads and the town's accusations. But now, armed with the evidence Sarah had uncovered, they began to look in a different direction. The focus shifted away from Mr. Carter and toward the dangerous figures Laura had been entangled with in the months leading up to her death. It wasn't long before the police started piecing together the full story. Laura had been targeted, her death the result of her attempts to escape a life of debt and fear. Mr. Carter, though flawed and haunted by his own past, had been trying to save her, not harm her. The town's anger, once directed squarely at Mr. Carter, began to wane. People slowly realized that they had been too quick to judge, too eager to pin the blame on the man they had once admired. But the damage had been done, and Mr. Carter, though cleared of suspicion, would never quite recover from the events that had unfolded. And as for Sarah, she felt both relief and sorrow. She had uncovered the truth, but at a cost. Ridgeview would never be the same, and neither would she. A few days after the truth about Laura's past and her tragic death came to light, Sarah found herself standing once again at the gates of Mr. Carter's mansion. This time, though, she wasn't here for answers. She was here to give one. Anna had been staying with her and Emily for a few days, and in that time, Sarah couldn't help but see the undeniable connection between Anna and Mr. Carter. The same blue eyes, the same quiet intensity that seemed to run deeper than just coincidence. It was time for Mr. Carter to know what she suspected all along. Anna was likely his daughter. As Sarah stepped into Mr. Carter's study, she saw him seated by the window, staring out at the rolling hills beyond. He looked worn, but the haunted look in his eyes had softened slightly, as if the weight of his guilt had finally started to lift. "I need to tell you something," Sarah said, her voice steady, but filled with the gravity of what she was about to reveal. Mr. Carter turned to face her, his brow furrowed in confusion. "It's about Anna," she continued, carefully choosing her words. I think she's your daughter." For a moment, Mr. Carter sat frozen, the shock of her words washing over him like a wave. His eyes widened as if trying to process the enormity of what Sarah had just said. He opened his mouth to speak, but found no words. His mind raced back to his affair with Laura, to the brief but intense relationship they had shared all those years ago. Could it be true? The revelation shook him to his core, but amidst the confusion, a strange sense of hope began to grow inside him. If Anna was his daughter, this wasn't just a second chance at life. It was a chance at redemption. A chance to make up for the mistakes he had made, not only with Laura, but with the loss of his own daughter, Lily. I didn't know," Mr. Carter finally whispered, his voice cracking with emotion. "If I had known, I would have. I could have." Sarah placed a hand on his shoulder. "You can still make things right." As the truth about Mr. Carter and his connection to Laura came to light, the town of Ridgeview slowly began to shift its perspective. At first, the townspeople were hesitant, unsure whether to trust the man they had once respected but had so recently condemned. There was still an air of suspicion surrounding him. After all, the events leading up to Laura's death had been clouded with mystery. But as more details emerged, the community began to see Mr. Carter in a different light. It wasn't just the affair with Laura that softened their view. It was the fact that Mr. Carter had tried to help her in her final days. He had tried to protect her, to shield her from the dangers that had ultimately taken her life. And now, with the possibility that Anna was his daughter, the town's heart began to open to the idea of forgiveness. Gradually, the community rallied around Anna, offering support in ways they hadn't before. Families who had once gossiped and cast suspicion began to offer help. Neighbors dropped off food for Sarah and Anna, and the local school held a small fundraiser to help with Anna's future education. Though the shadow of the past still lingered, the town was beginning to heal. Mr. Carter knew what he had to do. After everything that had happened, there was no question in his mind. He had to take responsibility for Anna, not just because she was likely his daughter, but because he owed it to her. She had lost her mother, her entire world had been turned upside down, and now she needed someone to give her stability, love, and care. In a quiet, emotional meeting, Mr. Carter sat down with Anna and Sarah. He gently explained the situation to Anna as best as he could, careful not to overwhelm her, but letting her know that he was there for her now. "I didn't know before," he said softly, tears filling his eyes. "But I'm here now, and I'll always be here for you." Anna, still wary and fearful from everything she had been through, didn't say much at first. But as the days passed, she began to warm to Mr. Carter. There was an unspoken bond forming between them, something that both of them sensed but couldn't quite put into words. Sarah, watching from the sidelines, felt a strange sense of peace. She had done her part, unraveling the truth and helping to bring Mr. Carter and Anna together. Her own bond with Emily had strengthened in the process, and as a family, they had grown closer through the trials of the past few weeks. For the first time in a long while, there was hope on the horizon. Just when it seemed like the town could finally begin to move on, a final, shocking twist shattered the fragile peace. Late one night, Sarah received a call from the local authorities. New evidence had come to light in Laura's case. The person responsible for her death had yet to be caught, and the investigation had taken an unexpected turn. The police had uncovered a trail leading back to the dangerous people Laura had been involved with, those from whom she had been trying to escape. The initial theory of Mr. Carter's involvement had been debunked, but now it was clear. Someone else had been pulling the strings, someone still at large. The revelation left Ridgeview shaken once more. While Anna was now safe with Mr. Carter, the knowledge that the real killer was still out there left the town on edge. The case wasn't as closed as they had thought. But for now, Anna was safe. Mr. Carter had stepped into the role of her guardian, and despite the uncertainty that lingered, there was a sense of relief in knowing that they had each other. The fight for justice wasn't over, but at least they had found some semblance of family amidst the chaos. As Sarah stood on the porch of her home, looking out over Ridgeview, she reflected on how much had changed in such a short time. The quiet, predictable life she had known had been upended by a single moment, by a crying child in the street, by a secret whispered into the ear of a man carrying a lifetime of guilt. It amazed her how one event could ripple through an entire community, changing lives forever. She thought about Mr. Carter and Anna, about the redemption that had come from their unexpected bond. And she thought about the unanswered questions, about the justice that still had to be served. As the wind rustled through the trees, Sarah found herself asking the same question she would pose to the viewers of her story. What would you have done in this situation? Could you forgive Mr. Carter? She knew the answer wasn't simple. It never was. But as Ridgeview began to rebuild itself, one thing was clear. Sometimes, the hardest path was the one that led to healing.